Good afternoon, friends. Welcome to Escambia Citizens Watch Live. I'm John Singley, your host. Today we're going to start unpacking some of the elements of the mayor's transition team report. And to start, because we've had this series on pedestrian safety in the region, I thought it'd be a good idea to invite Drew Buchanan, who led the mayor's team on walking and walkability and traffic safety. So Drew, thank you for joining us this afternoon.
Thanks, John. I appreciate you welcoming me back for the second time.
Yes. Drew is a friend to many of us around here and a good friend, and always one willing to discuss what's going on for the benefit of everyone. So Drew, you were appointed as a member of the mayor's transition team. How did that appointment come about?
Sure. So as many folks may know or may not know, I was one of 12 folks from the community selected to serve in a volunteer capacity to basically come up with recommendations and do a review of how the city operates, from issues like walkability, such as mine, to economic development, to financial and transparency. So how it came about was I've always been involved in the issues of walkability, even if I didn't know it. I've always been a amateur bicyclist. I've loved walking. My dog loves walking. I live downtown. And I moved to Pensacola in part because it had the bones of a walkable city, even though we have a lot of work to do. And I'm committed to being here. And I was so glad to be asked to volunteer for the transition team, just as the other 11 members were too.
So the mayor took the report here a week, 10 days ago, perhaps, almost 2 weeks ago, and it was all streamed. People could watch it. And so what we wanted Drew to do was to hear, while we have some time, he can walk all of us through what his report did, how they researched this material, how they talked to the public, how they drew some conclusions, and what the recommendations to the mayor would be. So Drew, I'm going to turn this over to you and let you drive this presentation and explain how this came about and what you found.
Absolutely. So I dealt with the issues of walkability, traffic, and even downtown parking. So I was charged with researching all of these ideas. And really what I did was a full audit of the city of Pensacola with regards to these issues. The biggest one obviously is walkability. Unfortunately, Pensacola has a distinct reputation as being one of the worst metros in the worst state in the country for pedestrian and bicycle safety. And Mayor Robinson, Chief Leiter, and many other community leaders have made it a priority for pedestrian and bike safety to be improved as we go on and progress as a community. Because if we can't walk safely, if we can't bike safely, if we can't get around our city safely, then what is Pensacola to the outside world, and what is it to us, most importantly? So I was charged with doing the full review, like I said. So we looked at everything from top to bottom. I interviewed city staff, I interviewed community leaders, stakeholders, everyday citizens, which was probably my favorite part. A lot of people have felt like they haven't been heard for a long time. And we have this emergence of social media, like we are here today, and citizen engagement has reached really a critical mass. So that is one of my favorite things that have happened with social media. Amongst all the other things, I think that's the highlight of why this technology is so great, because it allows people who are just everyday citizens, who may be at home, who may be walking around the community, to be just as engaged and sometimes just as vocal and heard as the biggest community leaders around your community. So I consider me one of those people. I moved to Pensacola really knowing no one, and I've been able to try to be an advocate for issues like walkability. So we did a full review of all those programs. We looked at other different cities throughout the country: Boulder, Colorado, Tallahassee, the things they've done locally, New Orleans, Davis, California. And we tried to really not reinvent the wheel, not to think within a vacuum, which sometimes we do, but to look what other communities have done, what other cities have done, and try to adapt those to Pensacola to see what works and to see what we can improve upon. And that's really what my report was based upon.
Drew, we at ECW Live, we try to bring interesting guests to keep everybody focused in on what we're saying. We don't want to be National Public TV, nothing more boring than two talking heads. So we like to look at graphic images and PowerPoint slides that tell a good story. So you brought one today. Let's take a look.
Absolutely. So I don't want to bore you with all this jargon, but walkability, it's kind of a new term. When I was first assigned to the issues of walkability in Pensacola for the mayor transition team, it was a new term to people. But really what it means, it's kind of common sense. It means how do we relate with it when it comes to a community? How do people get outside of their community? How do they feel comfortable walking and also biking and getting around their city? So what is it and how do we make it happen was the big charge of my report. So I wanted to go through a few slides here and show us kind of what we're talking about as we move forward. So this is a funny photo. It's me walking down Perdido Key, as many people in Escambia County love. But the quote is, "All truly great thoughts are conceived by walking." I would also include biking, but it really means that you have to get outside of your car and you have to interact socially with your community in order to really feel a sense of place. And when you live in a city, when you move somewhere, when you grow up somewhere, that's really what it's all about. It's not about getting from point A to point B, to going to work, to going home. It's about how you connect to your community. And that's really what walkability is all about. It's not about bike lanes, it's not about sidewalks, it's not about how cars move through a city. It's how you create a sense of place in places, especially Pensacola. So here's really the benefits and why this is so important. Right. Beyond the sense of place, we have an epidemic in this country, an epidemic in Pensacola and Florida. The obesity rate is higher than ever. People aren't exercising enough. We're not eating right. So we do need to start thinking about how we make our communities more sustainable and how do we make ourselves more sustainable. So the power of walking. We know it decreases the death risks when it comes to diseases, to cancer, and this all only takes a few minutes a day of walking. So walking your dog, walking to the mail, walking around the block, it makes a huge difference when added up over time, but not enough people do it. The same thing goes with cycling. It decreases your risk of death by tens of percents, 28% up to. So that's a big thing for us.
For those of you who are watching live with us this afternoon, if you have a question for Drew or would like to provide a comment to him, please post to the Facebook page here, the group that you're watching this on, and we'll try to take that and get it in front of Drew and let him answer you. So back to you, sir.
Absolutely. So we know the benefits. We know why making a walkable community is important. It creates that sense of place. But here's what we've done. We've created a community, our cities, where we have basically engineered physical activity out of our lives. So these are a couple of funny photos, and these are all real images. Some of them may be familiar to you. I've seen people walking their dog from their car. I've seen people line up in a drive-through, whether it's fast food or a pharmacy, and it takes longer in the drive-through than it would just be to get out of your car, walk a minute or two, and go get your fast food or your prescription refills. The top right corner is an escalator going into a fitness center. I'll let that speak for itself. This is a very popular meme when it comes to walkability. You have a photo of two roads. Both are 20 miles per hour, but only one of them is designed like it. So the top photo may look pretty familiar. It may look like the everyday road you have in your community, your suburb, Cantonment, Beulah, even in Pensacola. But only one of these images, one of these roads is designed for being 20 miles per hour. Lane width, sidewalks, how fast you go is completely up to how the road is engineered and designed. So the bottom image, drivers, it's a narrow road, it's narrow lane widths. The setbacks to the houses are closer, so you feel more uncomfortable. And that's kind of really how you slow cars down, how you increase walkability is you try to make people more uncomfortable so they pay attention to their surroundings. That slows them down, and ultimately it saves lives. So here's the big idea. Streets should not be simply for moving cars. We know that now. They should be places for all people. And this is kind of what I'm going into in just a bit about complete streets, which is really what my report is revolving around. You see this image, you see a light rail, you see a bike lane, you see a couple holding hands on a wide sidewalk, you see street trees, you see street lights, you see buildings that have short setbacks. This is how you create a more walkable place. And this is really what we're talking about, is creating a sense of place for your community. So this is one of my favorite historical images. John, can you guess where this is? If you were just to look at it.
That looked like it may have been in downtown Atlanta 50 years ago.
Close. So this is our beautiful Palafox Street.
You got to be kidding.
Looking towards Plaza de Luna, you can see the Municipal Auditorium, which I know a lot of people
Oh,
miss.
yeah, down at the pier at the end of the street. Right.
And that is 5 lanes, vehicle lanes, 3 travel lanes and 2 parallel parking lanes, and those are street lights, or those are traffic signals on each intersection.
Yeah,
Back then, it was one of America's worst streets. This is it today. This is Palafox Street, basically the same view, but looking north instead of south. And you see how much it's changed. It's 2 lanes now. You have wide sidewalks. We got rid of the traffic signals. We added street lights. We added street trees. And you see people walking across the street safely. And this is one of my favorite, examples between 2 images of Pensacola, because it shows that making a more walkable community, implementing complete streets is not impossible. We're actually already doing it, and sometimes we don't even realize it. And those changes were done mostly in the 80s, in the 90s. So this is something that we can do, and ultimately it led to Palafox Street, as many of us know, being named as one of America's best streets in the country. So that is an example of how we can identify problems and how we can move forward progressively. So adopting complete streets, I know you were asking what the report was about. That was, if there's one topic, one issue in the report, it's about complete streets.
This was your number 1 recommendation, wasn't
Yes,
it?
yes. So you may ask, what is a complete street? And I'll just go back to this image for a second. Palafox Street is the best example I can find in Pensacola of a complete street. Because whereas it used to be just for cars, just for automobiles, now it's for pedestrians, cyclists, universal access, ADA disabilities. Disabled folks are allowed on the street, and not just allowed, but they're encouraged through ADA improvements that are required by law. And traffic flows just fine. And if you were to ask anyone, I don't think anyone would say Palafox is a bad street or a bad place to be. It's the reason why Pensacola, the downtown, is becoming so thriving over the last few years, last decade or two. It's because it all comes back to Palafox Street.
Yeah, I will tell you, my family and I, we feel very comfortable as pedestrians on and around Palafox Street down there.
And that's the thing. 67 years ago, we started changing our engineering habits. So we started making roads wider. We started making lanes wider. We started increasing speeds. And while that's allowed for a lot of growth, a lot of that growth has been unsustainable. So we talk about downtown Pensacola a lot, and I know people kind of get fed up about it. But we talk about it because it's an example of what you can do to make a community more complete, not just the street. And you can spread those best practices out to communities like Brownsville, like even Cantonment, like Beulah, in the 9 Mile area.
Warrington.
It does not have to be just in downtown Pensacola. That's just an example of where we've done it well. And I do see in the next coming decades, next few years, next several years, that we will see these practices spread out into communities like Warrington that used to be more sustainable and livable, whereas now they're so car-centric. So I do see us changing, but that starts with changing the mindset of the community through top staff, through leadership. So Mayor Robinson's made it a priority through my recommendations to adopt complete streets as law. So that means whenever you go to redesign a street, resurface a street, you have to include pedestrians, cyclists, bicyclists, and everyone as you start to rethink that street.
So the City of Pensacola Planning Board, for example, would have to use that as a planning factor when it looked at development permits or anything having to do with road construction that belongs to the city.
Absolutely,
right?
yeah. And the thing is, it doesn't have to be expensive. And the thing is, if you don't, while we're all pedestrians at some point during the day, it doesn't have to be just about pedestrians or cyclists if you don't ride your bike or walk a lot. It also has economic benefits. Again, if you look at Palafox Street, if you look at complete streets throughout the U.S., there is a huge economic benefit to the community and the city that is realized when you make these usually relatively inexpensive and minor changes that can just change a community. Beyond that, that is the top recommendation I have. The next one is kind of a side effect of that, and that is the fact that biking in Pensacola is extremely dangerous. We know this through statistics. Walking in Pensacola is extremely dangerous. So how do we begin to take the steps to make a more complete community? And that starts with infrastructure and setting a list of priorities to implement that infrastructure. So I recommended that we create a Pensacola bicycle blueprint. And really what that is creating an interconnected network of roads for bicycles. So that means, yes, bike lanes, protected bike lanes is the key there. And it means creating an interconnected network. So you don't just have a bike lane on one street that leads to nowhere. It is spreading throughout the entire community, even beyond city lines, so that we create a regional interconnected hub for cyclists to safely bike on the road. Because again, it's not just good for the cyclists, but it's good for the entire community, because the economy thrives and the community thrives when you create a safe place for all people, all users, not just automobiles.
Drew, we have a question for you from the Facebook Live, ECW Live audience. They asking your personal opinion of the City of Pensacola CRA street improvements for A Street, Rue Street, and De Villiers. I guess this means these are new street improvement guidelines from the CRA.
Sure.
I think that's what it's talking about.
So I can give a quick background, and
Yeah.
I'm not afraid of giving my personal opinion. So last year, actually 2017, it's 2019 now. In 2017, the CRA, which if you don't know what that is, that's the Community Redevelopment Agency for the City of Pensacola. It's actually an independent agency. They bonded about a little bit more than $7 million, which is a lot of money for Pensacola. And they bounded that from tax revenue generated in the past couple of years from the CRA districts. And what they said is, we want to do streetscaping along A Street, Roos, and De Villiers. If you don't know where those are, they're on the west side of Palafox, in the Tan Yard and Belmont De Villiers neighborhood. And they recognized an urgent need to make those streets more complete. The issue was, when we first started those projects, and I say we, I mean the city, they weren't going to include bicycle lanes. They weren't going to really touch the asphalt on the street. So they were going to leave pretty much the lane widths just as wide, which they're about 16, 18 feet, sometimes 12 feet, which is way above the 10 feet standard for vehicle lanes. And when I found out about it, I kind of got involved real quick and said, hey, let's slow down the process a little bit. Let's get community input, public input, because at no point going forward in the City of Pensacola do I see a reality in that any major or even minor project that we set out to do with the City of Pensacola with taxpayer funds, that we don't include the appropriate amount of public input. That is a mandatory factor now. Mayor Robinson has made that clear. I've tried to make it clear. So going forward, when we do streetscape developments like A Street that are going on right now, we need to make sure those are accommodating all users. And that's something I'm trying to push for.
Well, Drew, I will say this. I think social media has made it much easier for the public to engage this dialogue. Not surprising that you recognize that early as well. I don't want this to be a social media discussion, but I got to say these type of changes occur when people like you, recognizing that the public can come in a more easier manner for them, can make change, can engage the discussion. And I think in Mayor Robinson's credit, he recognizes, he said as much recently. So we're living in the age now where, for not all of us, but for social media does enable citizens to more actively engage their government. I didn't mean to hijack your discussion here, but I just wanted to give you credit where credit was due.
I love that, because those are projects that are undergoing modifications right now. They're being designed. And if you do want to have a quick plug, if you do want to have some input, show up on March 19th in Belmont De Villiers neighborhood. You can find out more about it on Facebook for the public workshop on these streets that we've pushed to have held in Belmont De Villiers neighborhood.
Repeat that again.
March 19th.
Monday.
I believe it's on Monday or Tuesday.
Is it Monday? Yeah.
I can share a link after.
Okay.
To the meeting.
And where will it be?
That'll be in Belmont De Villiers at their community, I want to say, quote unquote, community center. It's the De Villiers Square building. and you can show up there and have some public input. The contractors will be there, CRA staff will be there, I'll certainly be there, and I'm going to be pushing for bicycle accommodations because that's a heavily traveled road for bicyclists, and to make sure we have proper sidewalks and such.
Well, I'll check my Facebook feed for a live stream of that, so I could watch from my back courtyard back there while I'm washing the dog, and so.
So beyond that, I want to talk about how we accomplish these goals. And a lot of times we get trapped in the mindset that we're just talking about the city of Pensacola when we talk about a lot of issues. This is a Escambia County Citizens Watch, so it involves really the metro. And I want to make sure that as we move forward, when we implement some of these projects, that we're working more with our county partners, our city partners, interagency staff, the Regional Planning Council, FDOT, ECAT. Everyone has to be at the same table because we may be all doing different things and trying to, with the best intentions, accomplish our own goals. But especially on these issues, because we know Pensacola is one of the worst areas in the country for bike ped safety and also for traffic safety in general.
You made in sort of the introductory part of your report, you made somewhat of a shocking statement. You said something to the effect, and I'll try to quote you here, the Pensacola Metro is among the most dangerous for pedestrians and bicyclists, not only in the state of Florida, but also the entire country, with more pedestrian and bicyclist injuries per capita than New York City and Chicago combined. What the heck, Drew, should we be thinking about something like this?
That is one of those figures I just found randomly researching one day, and I had to double check those numbers at this point probably 12 times, because I could not believe not only were the numbers in Pensacola worse than New York City, so then I went to the next biggest city, looked at LA and then Chicago. Not are we only worse than each of those cities for our rate per capita of bicycle and pedestrian incidents and fatalities, we're worse than all of them combined. And that tells you that there's something wrong with the way we've been engineering our streets in Pensacola. There's something wrong holistically with the way we've been educating folks. That includes drivers, pedestrians, and cyclists. And that has to change. So that means you have the 3 E's: education, engineering, and enforcement. Without each of those tiers, you will fail when we start to implement these goals. Because we can put as many road diets in place as we want, we can educate as many people as we want, right. But if we don't ever do everything together and cooperate together, we will fail as a community. So that is the biggest thing going forward. You know, last year we had 273 people hit with pedestrians and bicyclists. 27 people died. That is a staggering number for a place like Pensacola. We beat almost every other metro in the state of Florida and almost every other metro in the United States. This year, we're up to 4 fatalities already. We just hit March, and we've had 19 pedestrians hit and 19 bicyclists hit in Escambia County. Those are staggering numbers, and the biggest problem with this is, John, is when we see a pedestrian hit, a bicyclist hit, or even killed, or even a traffic fatality, we see it on the news and we just say, oh, that's too bad. And we become numb to the fact that this happens every single day.
Yeah, it's just easy to skip over it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I notice Northwest Florida is having the same problems. Navarre, Milton, Crestview, they're all suffering through this.
And that's the other big note.
Yeah.
It's actually not getting better. So we know traffic fatalities and injuries are going down, so car-on-car accidents. But the opposite is happening to pedestrian and bicyclist incidents. They're going up, and they continue to go up. It's because we're designing roads to go faster, for cars to go faster, and designing roads wider. We keep adding lanes to roads, which we know never works when you add lanes to ease congestion, because exactly this is what happens. When you add a lane, the congestion eventually keeps ramping up. If you look at LA, you look at other big cities, the more they keep adding lanes, the more congestion bleeds into that thoroughfare. So we need to educate ourselves and focus on those 3 E's: education, enforcement, and education, because without all those priorities, we will fail.
Drew, we've got another ECW viewer question here. I'm going to have to read this to you because it was
That's all right.
He's got a very thoughtful question for you. He starts by saying that bike lanes start and stop several times on every road between neighborhoods like Cordova Park, East Pensacola Heights, all connected to downtown. he says, this is not safe for adults, let alone kids. And then the question he asks you is, what are the plans to address this, connecting neighborhoods to downtown?
Sure. So I would argue most of the bike lanes we have in Pensacola, Escambia and City of Pensacola, are not fit for use. That's a strong statement, but that's what I believe in. Most of them don't meet current standards. For instance, most bike lanes in Pensacola throughout the metro are about 4 feet wide, and they're really just lines along a curb. And they're almost more dangerous to put in these substandard bike lanes to put none in at all, because it creates this false sense of security. So if we go to, I'm on this next slide right here, it gives you a quick example of what we should be doing. And these are bike lanes that work. They give you not a false sense of security, they give you a very real, concrete sense of security. So the question was, how do we move forward in creating an interconnected, safe network? Last week, I was on A Street riding my bike, trying to figure out the mindset of a biker on A Street every day, because I don't ride it on every day, but many people do. I was almost clipped twice, once by a school bus who came within probably about that close to me. And not only that, right after I almost got hit, I saw a mom, her name was Megan, and her son Radley, and they were biking down A Street, but they were biking on the sidewalk. And I said, well, that's what they have to do. But the problem is they were biking on a sidewalk that wasn't fit for use because it jumped a couple inches. It wasn't being maintained right. So not only was the road safe, the sidewalk wasn't safe. And I asked her why she was biking, and she said that was really her only way to get around town. She was using it as a form of transportation. So that's what hurts the most. But what we need to be focusing on is making a list of prioritized roadways to create an interconnected network and allocating funding towards those, just like we do for vehicles and for cars. So in these examples, you see a few things. You see painted bike lanes, which now are a national standard. They work because people see them, they're visible, and they make sure to avoid them. You see parking protected bike lanes, where the bicycle lane is separated from the vehicle lane and the parking lane. And then you see two-way cycle tracks. So what you're doing is creating a physical sense of separation that not only will increase your ridership, it will decrease the number of incidents. And that's what we want. We want to see an increase in ridership, because a lot of people will talk to me and say, well, Drew, not a lot of people bike in Pensacola. And it's right, about less than 1%.
What comes first, the bike or the safe street?
But what happens is, once you create a concrete sense of security, that ridership will skyrocket in places like Fort Collins, Boulder, and Davis, California, which are very similar in size and scope and geography to Pensacola. Anywhere from 15 to 30% of people that live in those towns bikes to work.
Well, I've noticed Mayor Robinson is out and about riding with the sanitation workers and working with the firemen. Maybe you can take him for a bike ride downtown.
I hadn't thought of that yet. Yeah. So Mayor Robinson, if you're watching, he just called you out. So we might have to do that.
Go ride with Drew down A Street. Yeah, that's a challenge. I imagine the cars are parallel. They are all on the side there. Yeah,
but to wrap up the question there, that's the important thing, is to prioritize a system of future bikeways. And this also goes along with sidewalks and multi-use paths. And the next important thing is allocate funding to implement those projects. And here's the thing is, this is my caption here, it's not rocket science. This isn't the hardest thing we've ever done, and it doesn't have to be expensive either. A lot of these things just involve restriping the road. They just involve new paint. So when we resurface a road, which we do every year, we might want to think of, well, should that street include a bike lane? Should we narrow the lanes? Should we get rid of a few lanes? Should we add parallel parking? Those decisions need to be made along every step of the way, so we don't have this hodgepodge network that creates a extremely unsafe
Right. I was out recently with Commissioner Underhill, a District 2 commissioner, looking at sidewalks and sidewalk issues in the district, and that was exactly what he said. He looked at the road and said, this road is due for resurfacing. It's overdue. Maybe when we resurface it, we can add enough space to create some walking or bicycle lanes with little or no incremental cost to the resurfacing project. Drew, we have some more questions here. This gentleman said, is the concept of allowing bicyclists access to sidewalks not in consideration, if not pragmatic, but for the cost-effective reasons? So he's got a two-part question there.
Okay.
Would increasing the width of sidewalks be a comparable solution to the, he's in parentheses, admittedly brilliant bike lane redesign? So I think the way I read this is he's asking about bicycles on sidewalks. Would that be part of a solution if the sidewalks were better engineered? Mr. Tanguay, I hope I got that right for you.
That's one of the best questions. So in the state of Florida, and certainly in Pensacola, riding a bicycle on the sidewalk is illegal. Is legal. Let me clarify that. Riding a bike on the sidewalk is legal. And many people do it because they don't feel safe on the roadway. So here's my personal thought on it, and this comes from many hours of research and talking with subject matter experts. If we have the ability on the roadway, and this means the width of the roadway, to accommodate bicycles, we should. Here's why. Bicycles, legally, are vehicles. They are just as legal as cars and automobiles when it comes to the rights of the roadway. And that means they must also abide by those laws. Pedestrians, for instance, are not vehicles. They are meant to be completely separated at all times from the roadway. So that said, if we have the ability and the width in the roadway, we should be making bike lanes where appropriate. And that means creating wide enough, buffered, protected bike lanes. That said, if we have enough right-of-way for the sidewalk, we can certainly, and we should also look into making multi-purpose paths, but that also is much more expensive, just to clarify, because concrete is typically much more expensive than asphalt and restriping. So that's one of those points. If at all possible, when you have the funding resources, you want to make a multi-use path, especially if it's on a high-speed corridor. I'll use Perdido Key Road. I forget the highway number for that. But that should really be, and it is going to be, a multi-use path. The same for Highway 98. That should have a multi-use path because the traffic is going 45, 50, sometimes, unfortunately, 60 miles per hour. So that's kind of my personal opinion backed up by research there.
Drew, as we approach here the end of our time here on today's program, and Mr. Tanguay, I hope that did answer your question. I think a lot of people are interested about bicycles on sidewalks. So, Drew, thank you.
Thank you.
Let me fast forward, if I could, a little bit to your recommendations about improving the parking experience. This is a trending topic on Facebook, parking downtown. Anytime I see that issue on Facebook, it generates many opinions. So talk about how you arrived at that recommendation.
So I venture to gather, I haven't asked, one of the reasons why I was asked to volunteer to look at downtown parking is because I was one of the most frustrated users of downtown parking. So let me clarify it with that, because who knows, I might be the hated guy because of my recommendations. But what I looked at was trying to make a holistic approach to downtown parking, because my view was we were making decisions within a vacuum and we weren't including enough public input. So what we did was we said, all right, let's take a step back, way back, and say, what are we doing right, which is not that much, and what can we do better, which is a lot. And we've looked at it and said, all right, what are other cities doing? Like I've said again, we've learned from Donald Shoup, who is probably the most renowned subject matter expert when it comes to
He was a
parking
Civicon
experience.
speaker.
He was.
Yeah, right. I remember.
And the rule is we should eliminate downtown parking minimums, which, to be fair, we mostly have. But we should also do that citywide, because the reason why we hamper economic development and small business development a lot of the times is because we just have to provide parking spaces. But then that bleeds into, well, if you don't provide parking spaces on your private property, then they're going to have to find public parking somewhere else. But here's where the facts remain. In downtown Pensacola, we have a ample supply of downtown parking. But there are a few issues with that people don't realize. One, people don't know where to park. Two, the parking experience is extremely frustrating. And three, the user experience can be inhibitive, that if you keep going around a block, you may just give up and go back home. And I completely understand that.
You've been talking to my wife again.
I talked to many people. So among my recommendations, I'll go through them real quick, is I've asked, and this has pretty much been completed, to remove all inoperable and broken parking meters in downtown Pensacola. If that's not already done, it should be done in the coming weeks. We've also asked for the city to open up its publicly owned parking garages, the city and county. We have a 700 space parking garage in downtown Pensacola. It's the Intendencia Street garage just west of Palafox that is usually completely open at night, but usually not used. The only time it is used is during special events, and we charge 10, 15, 20 bucks. And I think that's unacceptable. We should be charging a rate that most people can afford. So $2, $3, $4 like they do in other cities. And we should make that publicly owned, taxpayer-owned garage open to the public. There's also a few other garages. So here's the thing. We actually don't have to build more garages, not at this moment. We have them. We just don't have them opened up. And the other thing is we need to eventually transition to a dynamic parking system. So the farther away you want to park, the more incentive there is because the price will be lower or free. The closer you want to park to your restaurant, I won't use an example. Most people are so used to parking right in front of their restaurant to go to eat. That can't be the standard anymore because Pensacola is growing. And that's almost too much of a good thing, but it means you may have to walk a block or two if you want free or very cheap parking. And that's just a fact of life. So that's the biggest things in my report. You go to Transition Pensacola to read the full thing. But my biggest goals were to reduce the frustrations of downtown parking. That also includes possibly implementing a downtown shuttle again. I'd like to see an electric shuttle bus come back that would be free for users. That way folks that are disabled or elderly who can't walk can have another means to get from their parking spot to their restaurant, their theater, or whatever they want to do to enjoy downtown Pensacola.
Drew, this has been a great discussion. In the remaining 2 or 3 minutes we have here, I want to throw a pet rock out here. I'm a big fan of walking trails. We like to walk. We can't run as much as we did in the past. And when I go to other cities like Clearwater or even Fort Lauderdale, I notice the cities have these connected old railroad right-of-ways and walking trails. And I was talking to Commissioner Underhill again not long ago about these, and he said the state has grant money for this type of stuff, and there's plenty of resources available. I mean, they're not throwing money away, but if it's a worthy project, they can take it. So where do you see walking trails? I see where Studer Properties this week announced publicly that they had brought in a consultant to look at what they called, I think, the West Main project. And he talked about everything had to be within a 5-minute walk. Well, but there would be these interconnected walking trails. Yeah. Could you comment on that, how you see that?
This topic is probably one of my most favorite. Before I moved to Pensacola, I love to experience these types of trails in different cities. In Atlanta, you have the Beltline. In New York City, you have the High Line. I think Mayor Robinson just experienced that for the first time. In New Orleans, you have the Lafitte Greenway. And these trails aren't just good for your health, for your quality of life. They are tremendous benefits to the economic development and success of a community. So I take a big strategic approach to this, and this is what I want to focus on in the coming years in Pensacola. But we have several different projects that are coming to fruition or in the planning stages. One of them is the West Main, whatever you want to call it, west of Palafox along the Maritime Park and the public waterfront, to create a waterfront trail that is extremely doable and feasible. We just have to have the political will to do it. Another is the Hollis T. Williams Greenway, which is underneath I-110, which can be a great corridor that will be shaded for connecting two communities to a urban linear greenway that leads to downtown Pensacola. Another one is a project that I have a lot of personal investment in is the scenic bluffs along the railway. We don't necessarily need to create a rails to trails. We may not be able to get rid of the railway. That's extremely expensive. But what we can possibly do is do a rail with trails projects. And this there's a similar project in San Clemente, California, where they built a trail along the railway, and they got permission from the railway. And every time you build a project like that, the incidence, because it's along a railway, of pedestrians being hit goes down. And this is because you create controlled access points across the railroad tracks. So I think if we do all of these projects together, it's going to take a lot of political will and a lot of funding, but that funding is available. And you said they don't throw it away, but sometimes it can feel like that. Not only from the state and federal government, it can be there for the taking. We just have to ask as a community. We have to have a united ask. So I'd love to work with all of our regional partners to get these projects done. That means everyone working together to create an interconnected system to raise the community up. So I'm excited about all these projects, and there might be a few more, but I'm really hopeful for the future of Pensacola. We're going in the right direction. It may not seem as fast as we want to be, but we're in a good spot right now. We just have to keep the energy going and the motivation going, and I appreciate you letting me come on and talk about this.
Well, Drew, thank you very much. And as Mayor Robinson said, thank all the volunteers on the transition team who gave up a lot of time and wrote these great reports to help make Pensacola better. And as Mayor Robinson said, this is not going to be something that we just throw on the shelf and then forget about in our day-to-day dealing with pop-up issues, but it's a blueprint, he said, that we're going to use to guide Pensacola going forward. Again, thank you very much, Drew. You're a good friend of many of us, and we're glad to have you in the studio. For those of you who've been live this afternoon, thank you for your comments and your questions, and hope all of you have a great weekend. So for everybody, Teresa Hill, all of us here at ECW Live, thank you, and keep on being engaged citizens. You're right down our wheelhouse. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.